Snow fell like sifted ash over the forests, and the trees stood listening. In the winter light, a column moved, men in mismatched uniforms, boots caked with mud, eyes bright with a fever that was not only the cold. They called themselves soldiers. The villagers watching from shuttered windows knew better. A name traveled ahead of them like smoke. Dirlewanger. He had once been a boy who read books. The University of Frankfurt gave him a doctorate. The Kaiser gave him medals. The Great War carved 6 wounds into his body and a 7th into his mind. He learned with the clarity of a man standing too close to the precipice that violence gives its own orders. Afterward, the peace felt like a bad joke. He drank, he fought, he chased shadows through alleys and found them turning into girls with frightened eyes. The courts tried to name his crimes. The party expelled him. But the Third Reich was a place where darkness was a qualification, not a flaw, provided it could be harnessed. Old comrades tugged the right strings. A patron whispered into Himmler's ear. Papers were signed. The fallen man stood up again. They found a use for him in an experiment that began with a lie. That poachers make the best hunters of men. Prisons opened their iron mouths and spat out 80 criminals, marksmen with steady hands and empty souls. They were told their sins had earned them a second chance and a rifle. The unit's name sounded official in the mouth, SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, but on the ground it meant only this. No rules, no breaks, no witnesses. Training at Sachsenhausen looked nothing like training and everything like initiation. They learned to obey one thing, Oskar. He was generous with beatings and stingy with mercy. Those who hesitated learned quickly how a leader establishes law among wolves. A man refused to shoot a boy and died with his back to a birch. Another drank himself into a stupor beside the body of a woman beaten to death. He was doused with water and sent back to work at dawn. Discipline in this new grammar was a synonym for terror. Belarus received them first. Villages that had stood for centuries disappeared in an afternoon, as if lifted from the earth by invisible hands. The method repeated with the precision of a factory. Surround the streets before sunrise. Drive the people to the square. Select the strong ones for trains that smelled of animal and iron. Pack the rest into a barn whose wood had dried under summer suns. Bar the doors. Pour the petrol. Strike the match. The flame spoke a language everyone understood. Reports rose like steam from the blood. Bandits eliminated. Area pacified. The numbers were large when counted as corpses and small when counted as rifles seized. Even officers accustomed to cruelty found themselves pausing over the arithmetic. A general muttered that these were not operations but crimes. Civilians wrote complaints to offices that had already decided not to hear them. An administrator protested that fields cannot feed an army if the peasants are ash. He was thanked for his diligence and told the matter had been reviewed. Promotions followed. Inside the brigade, the air was always saturated. Schnapps, sweat, cordite, the bitter bite of Pervitin passed out like candy before the march. They called their caches field pharmacies, and the courage that came from them burned hot and fast, leaving the men hollow and ravenous. Brawls flared without warning. A commander shot 3 of his own sentries for sleep. Their bodies were left as punctuation marks along the road. Women, those taken as prisoners and those wearing the Red Cross, learned that a uniform offered no shield here. A nurse barricaded a door every night with a chair and prayer. "These are not men," she wrote later, her hand shaking across the page, "but animals." The wolves grew bored of woods and were sent to a city. Warsaw had the look of a cathedral whose candles had just been lit. On August days, the sun lay across the cobblestones, and from cellars and rooftops, the home army raised its beautiful, impossible flag. Himmler gave the order that had no room for ambiguity. Kill everyone. There was work to be done, and Dirlewanger's brigade, drunk and roaring, arrived to do it. In Wola, the city learned how quickly streets can change their names. Hospitals became slaughterhouses. Patients lay in beds, white sheets reddening, as soldiers moved from room to room calling out numbers that were not meant to be answered. Churches echoed with machine gun fire instead of hymns. In a factory yard, the walls became a sudden, permanent gallery of bullet-pocked grief. The women who could run were made to dance first. The women who could not were made to watch. Somewhere in the din, Oskar himself, his mouth filmed with spirits, paused long enough to choose a few for later, and then waved the rest toward the ditch. 5 days passed. The smoke made a second sky. Even among murderers, the brigade stood out as an affliction. Officers who had never blanched at the sight of death began to look away. Reports hardened into condemnation. These are criminals in uniform. These are flames set to our own house. But condemnation is a soft weapon in a hard war, and the unit kept its orders. When real barricades rose and real fighters answered fire with fire, the wolves tripped over their own bravado. A squad with 1 machine gun and 3 bottles of petrol sent them reeling 3 times in a single afternoon. From a command post, a voice crackled over the radio. "What should I do with these men? They are more dangerous to us than the enemy." The brigade's victories were always the kind that could not be held, and the Eastern Front had begun to move like a tide finally turning. Snow came early to the mountains, and the retreat snaked west through Slovakia and into Hungary, shedding men the way a diseased tree sheds bark. Desertions multiplied. The volunteers dragged in from Soviet camps vanished into forests the first night they were given shadows to hide in. Those who remained were kept in line by the same calculus that had always ruled them. Fear of the man beside you, fear of the man above you, fear of being the next example. Near Lake Balaton, the order arrived to hold ground against tanks with little more than rifles, and a few prayers half-remembered from childhood. Radios coughed pleas for ammunition. None came. A headquarters company vanished under tracks and treads. Out on the road to the city that was already ending, a rumor leapt like a spark. Dirlewanger had fled. The truth was less dramatic. Wounded, dragged to a field hospital, his skin gray and his hands twitching for the bottle that never found his mouth. Rumor did what bullets sometimes cannot. It dissolved the last threads holding the brigade together. Each man now belonged to himself and to the road. He was found in civilian clothes with borrowed papers and an old name that tasted like a joke, Berger. The city was Alsace or Allach or Altshausen. Men argue still about the spelling when the fact refuses to change. The official line held that he died of injuries. An unofficial chorus says different. Polish laborers recognized him. Doors opened in the night. The beating was thorough, the questions few. A French doctor wrote "cardiac arrest following trauma" in a hand that betrayed no feeling. No ceremony marked the burial. The earth did not spit him out. Some of his men were captured and never seen again. Some learned to pronounce foreign deserts and jungles, their new lives bought with old skills. The Foreign Legion took them in, as war always has room for men who know how to make other men die. A few returned to streets that had learned to smile again, became policemen, clerks, neighbors whose past only occasionally shone through like a shard of glass in the garden. Sometimes a survivor would look up in a market and freeze, a sack of potatoes slipping from her hands as a familiar jawline turned, and, for a second, felt the weight of her stare. Memory found its architecture. In Belarus, a field of chimneys stands without houses, each one crowned with a bell that rings into the wind every 30 seconds. In Warsaw, the cobbles carry the sound of absent footsteps. A child presses a palm to glass and looks at a map of names, trying to understand how a city can be forced to swallow its own people and then talk as if it were full. An old man sits on a bench in August and closes his eyes. The smell of smoke returns with the heat. The historians did their work, lifting stones briskly, noting the insects, measuring the shadows under them with rulers made for such things. They wrote careful sentences about structures and ideologies and the function of terror. Psychologists borrowed words from Greek and Latin to describe how a man can live 2 lives in one body, how the self can be divided into who eats soup with his children and who empties a pistol at a stranger kneeling. Useful words, incisive and sterile, like scalpels. Survivors spoke a different language. They described the sound of laughter at the edges of firelight, the way a uniform smelled after a long day of murder, the small, unforgettable tremor in a commandant's right hand when he reloaded. There were always the exceptions, slim as a matchstick, blazing briefly. A German soldier sliding a heel of bread into a child's hand and looking away before anyone could name what he had done. A doctor who hid ampicillin in his coat. A boy who stepped forward into a blow that would have broken his sister's spine. In the arithmetic of the time, these gestures add up to nothing. In the memory of the living, they alter the angle of the world by a whisper. In courtrooms, the law tried to find a voice that could speak to what had happened. Some verdicts were heavy and landed with a thud that echoed for years. Some were so light they floated out the window before the ink had dried. A man who had helped burn a village explained into a microphone that he had taken orders, and the word orders did not at first sound like the smallness it contained. A nurse who had stitched a wound closed with hands that would never stop shaking told the judge that her patient had clung to her as they dragged him away. The judge wrote "noted" in the margin. The page rustled. Papers turned into shelves. Shelves turned into archives. Dust eventually came for everything. When the century turned and the dead began to die a second time, of age, of distance, of being outlived by their own stories, new arguments started up in living rooms and parliaments. Were the wolves born or made? Does a man begin as a blank page on which history scrawls its instructions, or do some arrive already inked in a secret alphabet? The answers changed nothing and altered everything, like rain. On certain winter evenings, the forests look almost as they did before. Snow lays a white glove over the blackened ground. If you stand very still, the only sound is the low thrum of your own blood. You could believe the earth had forgotten. It has not. Step in any direction long enough, and a bell will ring somewhere for someone whose name you do not know. Walk farther, and you will find a marker with the letters worn down by weather and by the hands that trace them. Linger, and you might hear, under the wind, the old vows being made again in the mouths of the living, to notice, to resist, to say no while the word still has teeth. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not a storm that passed. It was a warning that stays. It shows what happens when a state decides that cruelty is useful, that criminals are tools, that a uniform is a baptism that can wash anything clean. It shows how quickly the distance between a man and a monster can be measured not in miles, but in permissions. The brigade's end was not the end of what it taught. Techniques travel. Habits migrate. A hand that learned to close into a fist in one war opens the same way in another. The vocabulary of torture needs only a new dictionary to feel at home, and yet the world goes on breaking bread. A woman in Warsaw hangs laundry in a courtyard where the stones remember. A tractor tills a field in Belarus, and the furrow uncovers a spoon, a coin, a ring, a button that once knew a throat. A museum guard locks a door at dusk and rests her forehead against cool glass before turning off the light. The living are experts at moving forward. The dead are experts at waiting. They do not mind if it takes you a lifetime to come to them. They have all the time there is. At the end of a long telling, there is always the temptation to reach for a clean line, a sentence that snaps shut and leaves the room neat. This story refuses such endings. It ends like the forest ends, not with a wall, but with trees that simply thin until you are back in fields and the sky looks wide enough for mercy again. You are left with a handful of names, a series of places, and the taste of smoke at the back of the throat. You are left with one question that breeds only more. What would you have done? What will you do if asked again by a different century, a new uniform, a familiar order? A boy walks past a monument on his way to school and does not stop. A girl reads a plaque aloud and mispronounces a name. Her mother corrects her gently. An old man on a bench opens his palm and finds, to his surprise, a kernel of bread he does not remember placing there. He smiles, and the smile becomes something else. He stands slowly and crosses the square as if the air had become suddenly heavy. On the far side, a woman he has never met steadies herself against a lamppost. Their eyes meet. They nod, quick and almost embarrassed, a brief ceremony that belongs to those who have learned a private grammar of grief and recognition. The bells keep ringing. Every 30 seconds and then again. The forest keeps listening. Somewhere a file is opened, a testimony played, a face recognized across a room by someone who will not say the name aloud. Somewhere a child, tired of walking, asks a question so simple it cannot be answered without lying. Why? The adult beside them pauses, searching the air for words that will not collapse under their own weight. They say something about history and memory and the cost of forgetting, and the child nods solemnly, as if satisfied. The story for today will do, and you, having heard it, carry it a little while. You place it carefully where it will not bruise the daily work. It will anyway. That is its purpose. It should ache. It should interrupt. It should live beside you like a second shadow until the evening comes and the bells, in whatever place you call home, begin their counting. You will not hear them at first, and then you will. You will remember that there was a unit once, and a man who led it, and a country that found a place for them both. You will remember what fields look like when set alight. You will remember that the wolves do not always arrive as wolves. Sometimes they come as men who speak softly, with papers in order and medals polished, asking only for permission to keep you safe.